NATO countries, including Canada and the United States, have been clear from the outset that they stand in opposition to Russia's attack on Ukraine, sending aid and weapons. However, beyond that alliance, the world gets quite a bit murkier in terms of who stands with whom and why. India, China, some parts of the Middle East, and almost all of Africa come to mind. Let's find out why as we welcome in Atlanta, Georgia, Maria Repnikova, Associate Professor in Global Communication at Georgia State University and the author most recently of Chinese Soft Power. In Bloomington, Indiana, Sumit Ganguly, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Tagore Chair in Indian Cultures and Civilizations at Indiana University. In New York, New York, Rajan Menon, Director of the Grand Strategy Program at the think tank Defense Priorities and non-resident scholar in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And in Waterloo, Ontario, Bessma Momani, Professor of Political Science and Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation at the University of Waterloo. And Bessma, it's great to see you again. We haven't had you here in a little while, and it's wonderful to have three new voices on our program as well. Let me just put some background on the record here as we consider the state of the world today. On April 7th, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution calling for Russia to be suspended from the Human Rights Council. The resolution received a 2/3 majority of those voting, minus abstentions, in the 193-member Assembly. And that means 93 countries, including Canada, voted in favor, but 24 countries, including Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Vietnam, voted against. And 58 countries abstained from the voting, including India, Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Okay, Rajan, start us off here. What are we to make of the contrast between the West, which has been very united in its condemnation of Russia, and I guess the so-called Global South that have refused to condemn Russia?
Well, first, Steve, thank you for inviting me. It's very difficult to talk about the Global South in generalities because there are so many countries, but let me try anyway. I think in some parts of the Global South, there is a feeling that whereas the UN Charter, international law, and global norms are being invoked today to condemn Russia, and appropriately so in my opinion, that these same norms and laws and the Charter are cast aside when convenient by those now invoking them, as happened in the Iraq War. So there is a feeling that there are double standards. That is the general reason. Now, the particular reason has to do with the particular relationship of countries like India and China and Vietnam and South Africa with Russia. But I won't go into the details of each because I don't want to hog airtime.
All right, to be continued then. Let's put it that way. And thank you for your generosity. Bessma, I'll pick it up with you, though. On those lists that I just gave, two pro-Western countries, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who purchased billions of dollars of arms from the United States, and yet they abstained. How come?
Yeah, pretty remarkable. Well, I think it's partly, these countries have not had a very good relationship with Biden. You can't ignore the fact that these are two countries that really enjoyed their relationship with Trump, felt very close to him. And in some way, they're hedging, thinking that Trump is going to come back. If not Trump, at least Trumpism will come back. That's certainly an issue. They also don't think that the Biden administration is very tough on Iran. They look at what the Houthi rebels are doing in their countries and say that this is something that needs to have a more firm response that they're not reacting to. And also, let's not forget, these are oil exporters. They really gain from having the price of oil quite high. And this is a boon right now for both of their coffers with oil prices above $100 a barrel. You can't ignore that. And lastly, very much related to that point, is that OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, has meant that they've had a very good relationship with Putin and with Russia. They have cooperated on a great deal of issues when it comes to production and quotas. And so I think there's a lot going on there, but it really is a testament to the fact the Americans just can't get their way, despite the fact that they are very much, patrons of the Gulf countries with a whole bunch of arms being going to them.
Maria, let me follow up with this. How much of China's decision, in your view, stems from its opposition to NATO versus its support of Russia?
Thank you for having me on the show. So China's relationship throughout this war, China's standing has been very complex. It's been trying to straddle this middle line of not condemning Russia, but also not embracing or actively supporting its invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, as I've argued in my Atlantic piece, China's pro-Russia stance has been largely a result or kind of revealing of its anti-NATO and anti-Western sentiments. And we see this in several ways. I mean, first of all, much of the rhetoric in state media and official statements has been positioned against NATO in terms of overexpanding, militarizing the region, and as a result, pushing Russia towards this act in Ukraine. And secondly, we also see that again, the double standard logic that was brought up earlier is very much prevalent in Chinese discourse. Why is the West not blamed and not held accountable for its own wars? And finally, I think China is very concerned about potential implications for itself when it comes to future, statements by the UN Security Council, but the UN at large is potentially isolating China for its own human rights violations. So it could be Russia today, but China tomorrow.
Sumit, in your view, why India? Why were they not part of the Western alliance on this?
I think there are at least three compelling reasons why India has abstained so repeatedly on the UN resolutions, including the UN Security Council resolutions. The three reasons are as follows. First, India is acutely dependent on Russia for weaponry. Close to 50% of India's arsenal is either of Soviet or Russian origin, and India cannot easily afford to break this relationship. Second, India has significant energy investments off Sakhalin Island in Russia, and also the Russians have bought at least one refinery in India and have also invested significantly in India's civilian nuclear power program. And finally, India counts on a veto at the United Nations Security Council on the Kashmir question with Pakistan from Russia. And Russia historically, and the Soviet Union earlier, had repeatedly exercised the veto whenever an anti-Indian resolution was introduced in the UN Security Council. And India can ill afford to alienate Russia on this critical issue. So all these three factors come into play in terms of shaping India's decision.
Let me follow up on the first thing on your list, which was weaponry. And to that end, we have a graphic here I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osman, to bring up. And for those listening on podcast, I'll read what's here because Russia's biggest arms buyers, here comes the list. And this is all between the years 2016 and 2020 and all expressed in US dollars. Russia is the world's second largest arms exporter behind, you know who, the USA, accounting for roughly 20% of global weapons sales. Moscow sold $28 billion worth of weapons to 45 countries during that 5-year period. Russia exports nearly 90% of its arms to just 10 countries. India, as was just indicated, is the largest buyer of Russian weaponry at $6.5 billion. That's half of India's total arms imports coming from Russia. China is the second largest buyer of Russian weaponry. That's just north of $5 billion. And 18% of its total arms imports come from Russia. But let's fill out the list. There are other countries as well. Algeria, more than $4 billion from Russia. Egypt, more than $3 billion. Vietnam, almost $2 billion. They round out the top 5 of Russia's biggest arms purchasers. Okay, Rajan, let's pick up the story there. We've talked about Russia's key role in China's defense. How about the Chinese reliance on Russian energy? How much of that is part of the story we're talking about here?
It's very important, Steve. Russia was a major supplier of arms to China. And at one stage, the total dollar value exceeded that given to India. But there are very substantial energy ties going on. China also has what is known as a strategic alliance with Russia. So its abstention or no vote in one case is no surprise at all. If I may take a slight detour to pick up on something that Sumit said, which I agree with, India has been blamed for not lining up and condemning Russia. But there is this pious belief underlying this critique that countries always vote with norms and ethics and never with their interests. Let us remember that most of India's oil does not come from Russia, it comes from the Middle East. Let us remember that Europe imports far more than India does in oil and gas from Russia. And let us remember that two major Japanese companies, Mitsubishi and Mitsui, have announced they will continue their Sakhalin Island project, and Japan has announced that it will continue importing LNG. So I think we need to be careful to put this blame game in context.
Okay, if I take your point, you're saying Western nations aren't completely clean with their investments in this either, and therefore they should stop poking at everybody else. Is that what I'm gleaning here?
No country in international politics is completely clean.
Gotcha. Okay. Bessma, let's go back to the Middle East. Russia is part of, I guess, what they call OPEC Plus. It's not a Middle Eastern country, but it sure is an oil-producing and exporting country. Do you think that's why so many Gulf countries are hesitant to criticize Russia these days?
Look, it's an important part of this. Absolutely. As I said, they've really relied on Russia to be a responsible producer. And I've had very good relationship with them in the past 5 years during OPEC Plus, where Russia participates in OPEC meetings, particularly after the JCPOA, when the Iranian oil was offline, when we had a lot of Venezuelan oil offline, and similarly Libya. So it was really important to deal with Russia. And I think many of these countries have appreciated how responsible they've been, despite the fact, of course, this is a terrible aggression on Ukraine. They have been responsible at the OPEC Plus table. And I think, the other thing to point out, as far as the arms are concerned, many of these Middle East countries are also buying arms from the Russians. You pointed out Egypt, for example. Even though they're getting a great deal, far more from the Americans, oftentimes they're buying from the Russians not because they need it, but just to sort of balance it all out, just to signal to the Americans that we don't necessarily need you. And it's a really interesting dynamic that we're seeing. Sometimes, frankly, we've been pointing this out, that, these countries don't need these competitive, arms that have no interoperability with the existing American arms, but they're buying it nevertheless as a way to curry favor with the Russians and to kind of poke the Americans in the eye to say, we don't need you necessarily. There are lots of other, providers of arms too.
Rajan, can I get you to comment on that? Because, of course, the first thing you'd think of is, if they're buying all this weaponry from the Russians, well, surely they can get it somewhere else. Why don't they just freeze out the Russians and get it somewhere else? But do you think Bessma's onto something with the explanations behind why people don't do that?
Well, let's take India and China, for example. China has become more self-sufficient in weaponry relative to India, but it still has a large percentage of its weaponry of one way or the other Russian vintage. India even more so. The transaction costs involved in switching suppliers when you have a force structure that is composed of arms from one country is very, very complicated and cannot be done overnight.
All right, let me follow up now with Sumit on the issue of number 2 on your list of 3 reasons, and that is the interdependence of energy projects between India and Russia. Give us a sense of how dependent India's energy sector truly is on the Russian Federation.
India does not buy, as Raj very correctly pointed out, a substantial amount of oil from Russia. The bulk of it comes from the Middle East and even as far as Venezuela. But that said, what matters most is that India has these investments, as I mentioned, off Sakhalin Island, from where it gets liquefied natural gas. And that is important. And in addition to that, what is vitally important for India is the fact that Russia is the only country that has invested in the Indian civilian nuclear energy sector. Other countries, most notably the United States, which made it possible in 2008 for India to engage in normal nuclear commerce through the US-India Civilian Nuclear Agreement, has not been able to step up to the plate because of the existence of an Indian law which places considerable liabilities on the supplier of even components of the nuclear power plants, not just merely the power plant itself. And consequently, most American companies have felt ill at ease about the likely liabilities that could accrue in the event of a nuclear accident. And there is no one willing to underwrite that risk in the United States, or for that matter, in any other advanced industrial country. Whereas Russia, the Russian state has been willing to underwrite these risks, and thereby Russia has invested significantly in the Indian civilian nuclear industry, and consequently the costs of breaking this relationship would be exceedingly high for India.
Maria, let me get you to start a round of discussion now on the quaint notion of morality in international affairs. I mean, we all know that countries always act in their own self-interest, but do you believe that India, China, some of the other countries we've mentioned here, ought to have a moral imperative to help Ukraine, notwithstanding all of the financial, military, and so on entanglements that they have with Russia?
Well, as an individual coming from the region and someone very closely following this war, I do believe that every country should stand up to Russia and to try to help pressure Russia to end this war. But looking pragmatically from the perspective of China, but also other countries in the global south, I think it's hard to imagine that these countries will shift their positioning anytime soon. In particular, this goes back to the reasons we already mentioned, but some other ones as well, which is don't see enough push domestically or in terms of their international interests to pressure Russia or to stand against Russia in a very explicit manner. I think, first of all, when it comes to morality, there's the argument about, again, double standards, which comes up all the time in Chinese rhetoric. The idea that, you know, the morality battle is not uniform, right? In this conflict, it seems that it's quite clear from the Western perspective who is evil, who is the right, who is wrong. But when it comes to China's perspective, for instance, it's not that straightforward. In particular, again, Chinese government and media journalists have often stated that the war is particularly a result of instigation by NATO, not so much the outcome or of direct fault of Russia. And secondly, I think we also have to think of domestic public opinion in all these conflicts. When it comes to China, Chinese public is barely aware of this war. Chinese media has not been reporting widely on this conflict for domestic audiences. If you open a major newspaper in China or watch television stations, you will see that Bucha massacre, for instance, was not featuring very much in this coverage. We don't see this grim harms against humanity, the crimes committed by Russian military featured in this coverage. So Chinese public is not really that aware. It's not pushing for Chinese government to act in a different manner. And Chinese public in general is very nationalistic and in fact has expressed similar statements to the government, very anti-NATO, anti-US statements, often mirroring Russian coverage and echoing Russian media coverage as well. So I think in that context, it's very hard to imagine China taking a more straightforward or a strong imperative against Russia. And I think more broadly also other countries like South Africa and other countries in the global south are concerned about economic repercussions of this war. Wheat prices are going up and there are very serious outcomes of this war when it comes to aligning with Western sanctions regime that these countries will suffer from. So I think from their perspective, again, it's not in their interest to act explicitly against Russia.
Can I ask you, since you opened the door, where are you from originally, Maria?
I'm originally from Latvia, so Russian Jewish background coming from Latvia.
And clearly there have been a lot of Latvians who are concerned that after Ukraine, they're next. So I would like to ask you, if morality were a larger part of the thinking of countries in the region, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would like to see a more unified response, right? So not as many countries abstaining from these resolutions, but rather voting along with the West and condemning Russia. When we see the evidence coming out, the various investigations taking place in Ukraine of crimes against humanity committed by Russian military, it's very hard to see ambiguity in this conflict. And I think the problem is that for different reasons, many countries see this as a proxy war of Russia against the United States, not Russia against Ukraine. And in this context, that's a misinterpretation, right? It is a war between Russia and Ukraine, even though other powers have great influence over this conflict. Russia and Ukraine are the ones fighting this war. And I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the discourse about moral ambiguity in this conflict.
Bessma, would you like to see morality playing a larger role in the thinking of countries that so far have been on the fence?
Well, I'd like to see more of a humanist approach. I mean, picking up on what Maria said, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is the challenge. And in some way, it's almost reflexive, it seems. Many of the southern countries are seeing this as though it's back to 1991 with Iraq. I mean, the same narrative is being pushed that somehow this is about regime change, that that the Russians are trying to prevent. I mean, it's absolutely absurd when you see this naked aggression of the Russians against the Ukrainian people. It's horrific. But, it's somehow very easy to go back to these frames of this is a war between, two superpowers, the West and the East, again, the US and the Russians. And let's not forget, I mean, this is really the Russian propaganda and disinformation that's out there. I mean, absolutely, the Chinese, the Indian media have picked this up, but it's a very comfortable framing, right? It's a very comfortable framing. And this is a way for many of these small countries to say, hey, the United States, you're not as powerful as you are before. We're not living in that unipolar moment. It's not even a bipolar moment. We're living in multipolarity. We are strong. We are nationalistic. Many of these countries have national populist leaders where there's a lot of pride in their success, both economic and political and regional. And again, it's a chance to poke the Americans in the eye. But it's a sad commentary because this is not being seen through the lens of reality, which is this is totally unprovoked. The Ukrainian people are suffering at the hands of someone who just wants to refuse that there's a Ukrainian identity. So it's sad, but it's very much, I think, a reality of, again, a lot of disinformation that including the Russians are very much pumping out through many, many various forums, including social media.
Rajan, let me get your take on this. Notwithstanding all of the complications we've addressed so far, do you think that the morality argument is something that, for example, China and India should be paying more heed to?
Steve, first of all, let me make it clear that I have no sympathy for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is a war that was not necessary. But I think it's quite wrong to attribute the stance of, say, a Vietnam or a South Africa or India to their being dupes of Russian disinformation. That's one. Second, it would be a very nice world if all countries acted on the basis of morality. But I cannot think of a single country, whether in the global south or the global north, that consistently does that. Third, going back to the frame of the Iraq War, let us not forget that in 2003, a preventive war regime change, which was a wholesale violation of the UN Charter, was launched. Thereafter, there was widespread torture, violating the Convention on Torture. Thereafter, there was mistreatment of prisoners of war, violating the Geneva Convention. So countries have a long memory. Now, when one says this, one is accused of whataboutism. That's, I think, a rhetorical dodge here. And I think one has to not reduce the country's considered judgments on this war in terms of simple Russian propaganda. Let me also add that both the Chinese and the Indians very clearly have said that they believe in the UN Charter and stand for the territorial integrity of nations and their sovereignty and their right not to be attacked. Final point, if everybody is engaged in Russia bashing, that leaves very few at some point, if necessary, to play the role of mediator. And India is one candidate, China possibly is another candidate.
Can I follow up with you, Rajan, in this regard? I suspect there are many Americans who would say, we understand your point, but that was the George W. Bush administration that brought in the notion of preventive war and torture and waterboarding and so on. And we have a different administration in place right now, and it is a very different administration that follows very different values. And therefore, don't obsess about what happened, 30 years ago, or with George Bush the father, or 15 years ago with George Bush the son. Focus on what's going on right now with this administration. Does that argument carry any water in your view?
Not with me. I don't think the Biden administration is some rarefied species that only acts on the basis of values and not interest. There are several occasions just since President Biden took over where allies or friends of the United States have engaged in practices that in no way comport with international human rights law, but haven't been condemned. And I'm not faulting the Biden administration for this, least of all demonizing the United States. It is simply a fact that international politics is a very difficult combination of trying to reconcile morality with interest. And when the two are in collision, alas, sometimes morality gives way. I wish it were not that way, but what I think doesn't matter.
Sumit, we haven't heard from you yet on this issue. Why don't you weigh in?
Well, to begin with, let me concur with something that Raj said about India. I can't speak for China, I don't follow the Chinese media with any care, but I do follow the Indian media. And I think despite the populism that Prime Minister Modi has promoted and has sought to shut down dissenting voices, I think there is still ample scope for dissent in India. And I don't think everybody is marching in lockstep with the government's view about Ukraine. I think there have been ample Indian intellectuals and social activists who have spoken out with considerable vigor, some of whom I know personally not to be overly self-referential. And there have been, I think, elements of attempts by Russia to spread disinformation in India, to use Lenin's famous term, through a bunch of useful idiots. That does exist. But I don't think there is a monolithic view by any standard in India. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second is that the Indians are really caught in a cleft stick. And bear in mind that in a week, Western Europe, particularly Germany, imports more oil from and natural gas from Russia than India does in an entire year. So it's easy to grandstand about morality and talk about how the Indians constitute an outlier when you have one of the most wealthy and powerful countries in Europe acutely dependent on Russian gas and petroleum. On Sunday in the New York Times, there was a front page story about Gerhard Schroeder, the former Chancellor of Germany,
yes,
who has extensive interests in Russian oil and natural gas, which he still refuses to part with. So this whole notion that somehow or other the West has a corner on international morality is sheer bunkum.
That's a technical international affairs term, right?
Steve, may I add a quick word on this?
Please.
I don't want to, by the way, make this just about India. If you look at Vietnam, for example, it has very considered reasons based on national security not to alienate Russia, given its concerns with China, given its dependence on Russia for arms, and given a long-standing security alignment with Russia. Now, you might say they should cast all that aside and simply line up with the West and condemn Russia, but I don't think that's a particularly realistic way of looking at the world. It would be nice if the world worked that way, but alas, it does not.
Well, I don't want to let Canada off the hook in this either, and Bessma, I'll bring you in on that front, because Canada, of course, has been at the front of the line condemning Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. But, you know, I've heard plenty of critics say that our hands are a little bit dirty on this because we're selling arms to Saudi Arabia, which uses them to perpetuate a crisis in Yemen and violate human rights, and, you know, and on it goes. Are we practicing a double standard here as well?
Of course we do. That's a reality. I mean, you know, this is not a surprise. Although I'll add that, you know, I think, you know, the Americans are and the Saudis and the UAE are far more complicit in that war. But the war in Yemen is absolutely a humanitarian disaster, an absolute shame. And it goes to the double standard back to the, you know, very first point. You know, this entire crisis in Ukraine and this war against Ukraine has raised so many you know, examples of hypocrisy and double standards. I mean, even the framing of this, I think many of us who are watching, you know, the refugee crisis, people's, you know, pouring into Poland, and, you know, these images of Polish soldiers giving cake and candy and toys to the Ukrainian kids, which again is the right thing to do. That's the humanist response. But, you know, we don't forget, it hasn't been too long where Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, African refugees were basically shot at the border. And, you know, they were not seen and received with that same warm, welcoming response. So there's an enormous amount of double standards. The media is complicit in that. We saw so many, you know, reports from journalists framing this as, oh, this is Europe, it can't happen to Europe. I mean, are you kidding me? You know, Europe has plenty of this kind of, you know, past and history. So it's really a shame, but I think it really is back to this point that you know, the world is very complicated, but, you know, if we don't have a universalist and I think humanist approach to this, we will continue to fall into this trap of seeing more and more double standard and hypocrisy.
All right, in our remaining time here, let's move our discussion up, as they say, to the 30,000-foot mark and figure out how this conflict in Ukraine is reshaping the global order. Maria, can you weigh in on that first? What are you seeing?
Sure. Well, it's a bit too early to tell how everything will be reshaped because much depends on how the war itself will conclude and whether or not the West will maintain its unified effort to push back on Putin, or whether Putin will emerge as resilient and Putin's regime alongside with that, or if it's going to be happening in parallel terms. But just a brief note on China, I think what we're seeing here is a somewhat of a paradigm shift when it comes to China's further decoupling from the West. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, China has expressed its pro-Russia sentiments, often veiled with anti-NATO and anti-Western statements. But what this means as well, what the implications of this are the following. And first of all, I think it's China's more intensive push towards the global South. We already see China is very active in the global South. And throughout this war, some argue that China is becoming more isolated. I would say that's not the case. In fact, it's reaching out stronger to India. It's reaching out to many African nations. And we're going to see China more and more integrated with the global South. And the second, I think, point to mention here is we're going to see China as more focused on its self-sufficiency, self-reliance. We see this coming out a lot in major high-level speeches from the recent Party Congress, self-sufficiency in the realm of energy, military, and economic governance. So less and less reliance on the West, but also arguably from Russia. We might see China renegotiating some trade terms when it comes to energy imports. But overall, I think China is going to try to rely more on itself when it comes to clean energy production and diversifying its imports from many other countries along the Belt and Road Initiative.
All right. Sumit, how about you? How do you see the conflict reshaping the global world order so far?
Well, I think so far is the operative term, because we really don't know how this war is going to conclude, whether Russia is going to hive off a portion of the Ukraine, whether the war will simply continue to drag out indefinitely. But one of the things that I think the world, and particularly the Western world, will have to think about is its reliance on global supply chains, which ultimately can be traced to the People's Republic of China. This was already interrupted in considerable measure by the COVID-19 pandemic and had significant economic consequences for the Western world, and particularly for the United States. This is going to be exacerbated. It has already been exacerbated by the war. And one hopes that there will be some serious thinking within the American corporate community about its headlong plunge into the People's Republic of China and its acute dependence on the PRC for any number of components, ranging from simple things that one buys at one's local supermarket all the way to complex automotive parts. And this, I think, will require considerable thought and discussion in the weeks and months ahead.
Bessma, let me put a concrete example to you. We know that in the West, there's been a lot of anger about the way Turkey's been governed over the last decade under Erdogan. Well, Erdogan's been pretty helpful to Ukraine so far. Is there any reevaluation of Turkey now going on in the West?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And it's really a shame, because if you just look at just yesterday, an intellectual and journalist was jailed on really trumped up charges. And, Turkey is jailing journalists at record speed. But yes, absolutely, Erdogan has rehabilitated his image in many ways in the eyes of NATO. This is, again, a man who was scorned, and people like Angela Merkel and others really didn't want to be seen, with pictures with him. And now he is seen as this responsible stakeholder in NATO, providing really valuable drones to the Ukrainians, shutting airspace of the Turks to the Russians. And I'm afraid to say, yes, this has really helped his image. And he's, I think, seen this as an opportunity. So, this is the kind of, I think, realignment we're going to see, in the NATO alliance, too. I'll point out, countries like Finland and Sweden, two countries that we never would have thought would want to join NATO. In fact, people talked about the Finlandization of NATO and how very much Russia wanted, Ukraine to follow that kind of model that Finland has of being neutral. Well, they're, clamoring to come in. to NATO. And that's really a result of this realignment that we're seeing. So it's also going to, I think, on the Eastern Front, really push a lot of countries to want to join NATO. And that's exactly, the unintended consequence of Putin's actions in Ukraine.
Indeed. We're down to our last minute here. Rajan, let me ask you this question. How might a diminished Russia have an impact on countries such as China and India that seem, at least for now, to be standing by Russia?
I think the Indians will probably recalculate the long-term value of Russia as a strategic partner, but won't let go of it. The Chinese will find a Russia that has much less leverage against it. Steve, if I could very quickly add, we haven't talked about one thing, that is the ramifications economically of this war. It will take, it's estimated, about $700 billion to make Ukraine whole again. About 25% of its population are either IDPs or refugees. The increase in interest rates will have catastrophic effects for low-income countries that are already swimming in debt. Inflation is higher, growth rates are down, and we're just seeing the beginning of this.
That was a very smart discussion, everybody. I want to thank you all very much for participating here on TVO tonight. Maria, Sumit, Rajan, Bessma, all good wishes to all four of you going forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you
Thanks very much.
Thank you.